So we're right now almost a month to this war. Reminding you, October 7th, Hamas launched the barbaric attack on the Israeli communities in South Israel, resulting in the war that we see right now. Israel infiltrated Gaza Strip, and this very day today, November 6th, the IDF spokespersons announced that Israel completed the circling of Gaza City. Gaza City is the major urban area in Gaza, and it's also the power center of Hamas. Its major commands and headquarters and so on are located in Gaza City. There was an interesting statement by the Israeli spokesperson who says that by concluding this encirclement of Gaza City, Hamas understands the meaning of that, and that was an interesting statement. The way I read that statement is that actually Israel says to Hamas two things. One is that Hamas maneuvering space in the context of the kidnapped is further reduced following the encirclement of Gaza City. And the second thing is that Hamas' major assets from a military perspective is the whole story of the tunnels. And now basically I think that when Israeli spokesperson says to Hamas, now we have divided Gaza actually to two parts, Gaza North and Gaza South. One of the meaning of that from a military operational perspective is now Israel has a growing maneuvering capacity to take care of the tunnels of Hamas, and at the same time, accordingly, Hamas' ability to further use the tunnels as it's been using so far, that ability is reducing. In a way, it's an interesting development from a military perspective, because I think that in a way it's kind of like further reducing the tunnels as assets for Hamas and more increasing the tunnels as a growing challenge for Hamas, because in the end of the day, if Israel is going, as it seems to be, like tighten the military pressure on Gaza City and simultaneously expanding its military operation on the ground, focusing more and more in the challenge of the tunnels, from a Hamas militants perspective, the meaning of that is they either stay in the tunnels or will have to go out of the tunnels to try to confront the Israeli power on the ground. And in both cases, the options for Hamas militants are not very promising, let's put it this way. So this is one interesting development today, exactly almost 1 month to this war. There was another interesting development. At the same time, the United States of America formally announced that it has sent a nuclear submarine to the region. And that has to do with the largest, I would say it has to do with the US policy vis-a-vis this whole crisis, this whole war. And in that sense, I think that we can say by now, I think that we can say that the United States, up until now, can mark itself a very significant achievement in the way that the Biden administration handled the situation. Because from the first moment, Biden administration actually sent a very clear message to Iran and Hezbollah to stay out and not interfere in the war, which up until now that is roughly speaking the case. And in parallel to that, that statement, that was backed by military deployment of massive US force in the region, sent a very clear message that the United States for now mean business. And I think that as of now, the United States can definitely say that it has been achieving a very significant achievement, meaning that it was able to, I would say, rehabilitate, it's the right word, rehabilitate its image as the leading superpower. Because when you look today at the region, in the end of the day, you see the major international player in the end of the day that is engaged with this story of the war is the United States of America, not Russia, not China. And so from the US perspective, up until now, the United States of America can mark a very significant achievement. Its allies in the region are now looking differently at the United States of America after a long period of time where they looked at the United States of America as a declining force. I've been saying all along since the famous speech by President Biden in the beginning of the war, when he made this famous, word addressing the Iranian and the Hezbollah and said to them one word, don't. And I was talking about the issue of the concept of projection of power. And I think that right now, a month into this war, we can definitely see that the United States was able to project power, meaning in the sense that the bottom line of this US policy is that up until now, as I said, Hezbollah and the Iranians are deterred. They have not entered full steam ahead to this war. And one of the major reasons for that is because they are concerned with the fact that the United States of America will use its military power, and it's a very significant military power. I think I said in one of my interviews that the best weapon is the weapon you don't have to use. And I think that at this point, the United States of America, as I said, I think they can mark a very significant achievement, but I have to add something to that. That achievement has to be monetized and exhausted in the sense that in the end of the day, the United States of America will make sure that its own statement, its own policy objective that was stated by the United States of America, meaning the end of Hamas rule in Gaza Strip, that objective has to be accomplished. Because otherwise, if that objective is not being accomplished for whatever the reason, that is going to compromise the United States achievement, and it's going to be a kind of like, backlash on the United States strategic interest and its position in the region. So I think it's very important to emphasize that yes, right now, the United States can mark a very significant strategic achievement, but completing the achievement has to be done while completing the political, the overall, the overarching objective, and that is to end Hamas rule over Gaza Strip. And in that sense, by the way, I think that the United States of America, as of now, did something very significant. They were able clearly to bring to its side major Arab players, the Saudis, the Egyptians, the Jordanians, who are openly siding with the United States statement that Hamas rule in Gaza Strip has to come to an end. And look, for someone like me who has been following very closely what's going on in the region for so many years, the Arab position, at least of those players, Saudi Arabia and Egypt, Jordan, United Arab Emirates, and I'm not talking about the rhetoric and the statements and so on, but the fact that the Arab states are actually coming very close with the United States and standing by this objective of ending Hamas rule over Gaza Strip, that fact is not surprising because they loathe Hamas. Hamas presents those governments, the Saudis, the Egyptians, the Emiratis, the Jordanians. Hamas presents a very significant threat. And so, as I've been saying all in all since the beginning of this war and also before that, none of those countries, governments, rulers shed tear if Hamas is going down. And this is very significant to understand. And it also emphasizes one of the things that I've been constantly talking about since the beginning of the war in my interviews, in the articles and so on. And I said, look, ending Hamas rule in the region is not only an Israeli interest, it's a Palestinian interest, it's a regional interest, and it's international interest. So I think that in that sense, we can see right now that there are two major positive developments, meaning the one is the military one. I don't have the Israeli military blueprints, but I think that if I'm trying to understand, based upon what I see on the ground, Israel can mark a very significant military achievement so far, and it seems like things are going according to the plan. And the second thing is the setting the political objective, ending Hamas rule over Gaza Strip, and not less important, bringing to that place also the major Arab players that in the end of the day are very, very significant for the day post the war when it comes to Gaza Strip. People ask me all the time, how long will it take? And obviously I don't have the agenda and the time frame. We are looking at something that is a long term. It's not something that is going to be done overnight. The military process has to run its course. We may be looking at something that could take weeks and weeks. But this is only one phase. I mean, there are other phases that has to be taken into consideration. Obviously, the post-military phase, the rehabilitation of Gaza, the whole story of like who's going to rule Gaza and how it's going to be done. At this point, we don't have a clear, I would say, master plan. There are some kind of like semi-baked ideas and thoughts out there. But I think more and more when I look at it, and it goes along with something that I've been saying for many years, that, and I've been saying that very clearly, Israelis and Palestinians themselves cannot reach any kind of agreement. And it's not the game of blame. I found Israelis and Palestinians mutually responsible for the gloomy reality, but I always say that any kind of Israeli-Palestinian agreement has to be and can be done only in a frame of a regional envelope, meaning bringing in the major Arab states that have interest in stability and stabilizing the situation. And I think that obviously it also refers to the issue of Gaza Strip. So I think that it's very likely that one of the things we'll see in the context of Gaza is some sort of like a regional frame that will be a major player in the day post the war in Gaza Strip. But I think also that it's quite clear that already by now I think that we could expect also significant movement, to put it this way, in the context also of the story of the Israeli and the Palestinian Authority relationship, in the sense of like moving forward to some kind of like an arrangement also dealing with the issue of the West Bank and other issues that are discussed for a long period of time between Israelis and Palestinians. So when I'm trying to look at the post-war situation in Gaza Strip, I think these are the major directions that we should be looking at, meaning this regional envelope, expansion of the discussion and the political arrangements beyond Gaza Strip, meaning that it will include also the Palestinian Authority, the West Bank, the Israeli relationship with the Palestinian Authority, reality in the West Bank, issues of the settlements in the West Bank. So I think that when I'm talking about post-war day in Gaza, we actually have to look at it not only in the context of Gaza itself, but also in a wider perspective of the story of the Israeli-Palestinian at large. And that should be, in my opinion, that indeed should be the direction. I've mentioned, I've talked about the Arab world and coming together with a clear demand set by the United States and Israel to end the Hamas rule. And there is also another aspect which is, of course, not surprising. I mean, the anger in the Arab world and criticism of Hamas is skyrocketing. And it's interesting to say that alongside the regular, I will put it, criticism, that criticism on Hamas is not, in the Arab world, is not new. Unfortunately, that criticism for some reason was not reflected in the Western discussion. But for years, particularly since 2007, when Hamas took over Gaza Strip, the Arab world has been criticizing Hamas, including Palestinians criticizing Hamas, saying to Hamas, look, you dragged Gaza Strip to havoc and to death and to destruction, and for what? What have you got out of that? This time, there are, in addition to the regular, I would say, Arab criticism, that criticism this time is further boosted. It's enormously emphasized because of a couple of things. First, there is a genuine sense of shame and resentment and disgust in Arab world because of the atrocities that Hamas and Islamic Jihad attack on October 7th. Many people in the Arab world, in the Muslim world, are expressing shame and anger with the killing of babies and raping of women and other atrocities that were conducted by Hamas. And it's a genuine feeling. It's a genuine feeling. Many people in the Arab and the Muslim world are expressing that. So this is one thing. And then there is another thing, and that is the fact that this time, so bluntly, it was proven so bluntly that Hamas leaders simply, not only they don't care about the Palestinian people, they want the Palestinian people to die because it serves Hamas. Arabs are watching Hamas leaders that are spending their time in fancy hotels in Qatar. Life is good for them, while the Gaza people are suffering the consequences of Hamas extremism and barbarism. Hamas leader Musa Abu Marzouk, one of Hamas leaders, is giving an interview, and he openly says, we dug those tunnels to protect our militants, not to protect the people of Gaza Strip. One of the interesting criticism I came across in the Arab world, an Egyptian commentator named Ibrahim Issa. Ibrahim Issa says to Hamas, he said, for the last 20 years you took over Gaza Strip, since 2007. You spent billions building those tunnels, fortifying those tunnels with cement that was supposed to be for building of hospitals and schools and other things for the people of Gaza. And he says, okay, never mind, you didn't do that, but didn't it occur to you to build one shelter for the people of Gaza? Not just to shelter your militants and your assets. So the anger in the Arab world is obviously boosting, and the anger on Hamas in the Arab world is obviously very much emphasized. And there is this element in the anger of the Arab world over Hamas, which is an interesting aspect, additional one, but from a different perspective. I said that, Hamas is not only not interested in defending the people of Gaza. Hamas wants to see as much as possible civilians killed in Gaza Strip. So that's the reason why Hamas is operating from these populated areas. That's the reason why Hamas is not taking care of sheltering those people. And the issue here is that Hamas, from Hamas' perspective, the more children are being killed in Gaza Strip, or the more civilians are being killed in Gaza Strip, it's good for Hamas, because Hamas knows, unfortunately, that it will get immediate solidarity with the international community, it will get immediate support by the international community, and that brings me to some of the things that we see very clearly this war, and this is what's going on in Europe and in the States, when you see that the presence of large communities of Muslims in Europe and Arabs, and also circles that are identifying with more progressive and leftist circles are actually, are coming together around this whole issue of the humanitarian crisis in Gaza and the killing of innocent people and so on and so on. So we got in some kind of an unholy alliance between Hamas, who deliberately, knowingly, and intentionally sacrifices people of Gaza for Hamas' own interest, together, and he's coming together with progressive leftist circles in the world. There is something interesting also about the whole issue of the demonstrations of Muslims and Arabs in Europe. We saw that in London and Paris and Berlin and other places. It's very emphasized. Those demonstrations are very emphasized. Among other things, one of the reasons they are so emphasized is because it's in a sharp contrast to the silence of those communities in the West. For example, vis-a-vis the whole story of the war in Syria, a bloody war that goes on for 12 and 13 years, or vis-a-vis the war that goes on in Sudan for a couple of months, and other places in the region where hundreds and thousands of Arabs and Muslims are killed by their own brothers. So this is yet another aspect that I've been watching. It's not new, but this time it feels like it's much more emphasized when you look at the whole story of the war that is going on. And then finally, and I think the most important thing to talk about, obviously, is the issue of the kidnapped. Hamas kidnapped 240 people, most of them Israeli civilians, to Gaza, kids and babies and women and senior citizens. Many of the kidnapped are foreign nationalities. Obviously, the international community, the world, they're all shocked by that. It's totally unacceptable. There is a demand for the immediate release of the kidnapped. The issue is that, again, for Hamas, and we are talking about a very viciously mindset-guided organization. The kidnapped are Hamas, one of Hamas' last cards to play with. And it's very obvious that Hamas will try to exhaust this card as much as possible, and particularly now when the pressure on Hamas is, military pressure on Hamas is increasing in Gaza Strip. Right now, when Israel accomplished this circlement of Gaza City, Hamas' dilemma vis-a-vis the whole issue of the kidnapped is going to deepen, because on the one hand, Israel says to Hamas, and it's backed by the international community and the United States, up until now, there will be no ceasefire before the kidnapped are going to be are released. And on the other hand, Hamas needs to try to exhaust, and if Hamas fails to comply with that, the Israeli military pressure is increasing every moment. And on the other hand, Hamas, only one of the fewest last cards Hamas has in its possession is the issue of the kidnapped. So I think that unfortunately we'll continue to see this vicious game going on with all the attempts of to broker some kind of a deal. In that sense, there has been something that has been recently, for the last really 2-3 days, percolating into the discussion, and this is, some people are talking about a possible complicated scenario where actually it ends up with something that we saw, something similar to what we saw in 1982, when Israel invaded Lebanon to end the terror attacks of the Palestinians, organizations who were based in South Lebanon. Back then in 1982, in the summer of 1982, the Israeli military move ended up with the deportation of all the militants, these Palestinian militants and their leadership, including Yasser Arafat, who were based back then in Lebanon. They all basically left Lebanon on a ship. They left Lebanon, they were deported. Most of them went to Tunisia and some other place in the Arab world. And in the last couple of days, there have been some kind of talks here, basically saying maybe we'll see the repeat of that scenario, meaning that as part of a complex deal with Hamas leaders, and as part of the context of the story of the hostages, of the kidnapped, there will be some sort of a deal where Hamas leaders will be allowed to leave Gaza Strip to go elsewhere in the Arab world, wherever, and the kidnapped will be released. I don't know to say how viable this scenario is. There are differences between the story of Hamas today in 2023 in Gaza Strip and the story of the Palestinians in Lebanon in 1982. The Palestinians in Lebanon in 1982 were basically guests in Lebanon. They were not indigenous. They were not. So it's a totally story. Hamas leadership are from Gaza Strip, those who are in Gaza Strip. And of course, there are those who are not staying in Gaza Strip. And also in the sense of the mindset of the leaders of Hamas, particularly those based in Gaza Strip, like Sinwar and Def and others. It seems to me like they are kind of guided more by this mindset of Samson choice, sort of speaking. If I'm going down, everybody's going down with me. It's a kind of determinist outlook. I don't know to say if I can see Sinwar or Def or others of Hamas leaders in Gaza Strip who are based there. I don't see to say that they are going to leave Gaza Strip because I don't really think that this is their mindset. And so I don't know to assess at this point what's the viability of such a scenario. And then we also have to remember that Israel, formal objective of this war is to end and topple down Hamas rule over Gaza Strip, and it's also the United States' formal objective. A couple of days ago, and it goes back to what I was talking about, the mounting criticism on Hamas, including within the Palestinians. Palestinians in Gaza Strip, there is something about the story of Hamas in Gaza Strip that is complex. Hamas is from Gaza Strip. It was born in Gaza Strip in the 1980s. It has a strong presence in Gaza Strip, meaning in sense of like, it has a strong support base in Gaza Strip. There are hundreds of thousands of people in Gaza Strip who benefit Hamas rules. I mean, Hamas governs Gaza Strip since 2007. You know, he employs 50,000 officials and preachers and academic teachers, and he sets the agenda, the curriculum at school. He's charging taxes, he legislates laws, he has police and courts and all those things. So it's the government of Gaza Strip. More than that, you know, in the elections in 2006, majority of Palestinians supported Hamas, knowing what Hamas' agenda is vis-a-vis Israel, meaning that Hamas votes to eliminate Israel through the use of power. That being said, on the other hand, there are many people in Gaza Strip who loathe Hamas, who hate Hamas. Hamas, in the end of the day, is a very brutal organization, and he established itself an Islamic emirate in Gaza Strip. And for Hamas, this is the most significant thing, and nothing stands on the way to make sure that this emirate will continue, at least from Hamas' perspective. So Hamas brutally oppressed any opposition and criticism in Gaza Strip, and fueling with that, of course, growing anger and resentment of people in Gaza Strip. And of course, the whole destruction that Hamas inflicted upon people of Gaza Strip basically further fuel this anger. And right now, obviously, when you see the disastrous outcome for Gaza Strip following Hamas' brutal attack, obviously the criticism is mounting. And so there was an interesting note by the Israeli Minister of Defense that kind of like went a little bit under the radar, but I think it's interesting to mention that. A couple of days ago, the Israeli Minister of Defense, Yoav Gallant, said, he said, well, we are going to get to Yahya Sinwar, the leader of Hamas in Gaza Strip, and we are going to kill him. And then he added, unless the people of Gaza Strip will get to him first. And that will make this war shorter. And this is an interesting note, because basically it reflects the understanding that there are many people in Gaza Strip that would like to see the end of Hamas. And maybe that was kind of like I wouldn't even say a hint, but it's a very direct call for the people of Gaza Strip who wants to get even with Hamas to do something, and actually by taking down, eliminating themselves, Sinwar and other leaders of Hamas in Gaza Strip, they will actually help themselves, because the war then will be shortened. So it was an interesting note by Gallant that kind of like went a little bit low beneath the radar, but I think that, by the way, it's one of the things that I've been saying all along since day one of this war, is that the more Israel is present on the ground, the more the military pressure, the more Israel has a better intelligence flowing in, because many people are even I would say voluntarily, so almost are providing this intelligence. Obviously, intelligence is extracted also by Hamas militants that have been caught, and they are providing intelligence and information. I remember myself sitting in the studio in the first day of the war, that in October 7, that terrible Saturday. I was an hour into this event. I already started, giving interviews to, Fox News and CNN and I-24 and many other channels. And I was sitting in the studio, and I said, this is also a strategic opportunity for a positive change for the state of Israel and for the region. And I actually said, look, if but it requires that Hamas will be toppled down, that Hamas will be no longer be able to be a relevant player in the Middle East. And I explained and I said, look, if we topple down Hamas, we are actually totally disrupting the Iranian master plan to become the dominant superpower in the region. The Iranian regime has been advancing that master plan for the last couple of decades, which basically cost the life of hundreds of thousands of people in the region, and a constant violence and destruction in Iraq, in Syria, in Lebanon, in Yemen. Israelis, Palestinians were sacrificed by the Iranians for their own interest. So I said, look, if Hamas, which is a very significant component in this Iranian structure, if Hamas is toppled down, the Iranians, this is a major blow to the Iranians. It's totally disrupting their master plan. And that could be a very significant strategic positive shift for the region. And I'm totally, sticking to that observation. And as I said many times, I hope that this war is going to end up with the end of Hamas as a relevant player. Meaning that doesn't mean that you have to shut down Hamas' last tunnel and to hunt down the last rocket. It means that Hamas, that by the way views himself as a regional player, that Hamas will no longer be a relevant player that can influence. And the condition to make it happen is first and foremost to deprive Hamas from its military spine, because this is the major tool with which Hamas was able actually to influence and dictate its policy. Once you crush, demolish this military spine, you are actually taking away from Hamas its most significant tool, and by doing that you are making Hamas irrelevant player. And one of the things that came very constantly in the many interviews that I gave and discussions with people and briefings, people says like, yeah, but Hamas is not going to disappear and the ideology is not going to disappear. And I said, that's correct. But that's not the case. I'm always saying, look, Nazism exists. That's not the point. I mean, Nazism exists. But Nazi Germany was defeated in 1945. That's the same with Hamas. The ideology will remain, like the ideology of Al-Qaeda and ISIS. But if we topple down Hamas rule, and Hamas is no longer a relevant player, meaning a player that can influence the dynamic, a player that can influence the trajectory of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, that is the strategic achievement, because then it is basically totally disrupting the Iranian master plan. It basically presents a totally new horizons for the people of the region, the governments in the region that need stability, like Egypt and Jordan, United Arab Emirates, the Israelis, Palestinians. That will be a positive strategic change. That's what I said since day one of this war, on October 7th. And I said, and I was very clear, but the condition for that is to eliminate Hamas rule in Gaza Strip, to eliminate its military power, making Hamas irrelevant player. That's a must if we want to move forward into more positive trajectory.